Hi, now for page classification for sources that influence the knowledge panel today, Anton Shulke, your friend and mine. Now here's the page, it's step 4 in the process, and we can see here that we've got pre-classified pages by the Kalicube system, and we've tried to do our best automatically to classify the pages. We can see we've got data sources, profiles, own site with content about the entity, review, article about, podcast, article by, event or conference, video, webinar, article contributed, comparison page, and then these are the ones which are not so very important because they're not ones that particularly influence the knowledge panel. As we'll see in a moment, it's up to you what you do with those pages and how you save them to the system. We have a filter here, which I'll show you in a moment. And we have this, which is the magic button, which we all look forward to clicking on, which is send everything that's left to the bucket. And the bucket is this kind of big collection of all the things that we don't really want to deal with in the context of knowledge panels. And that is when you hit what I call the sweet spot. It's the moment when you see that the results that Kalicube has found are consistently not helpful, i.e. not this entity, only a mention, or inappropriate to helping us with the knowledge panel, at which point you can actually just throw everything in the bucket. And it's incredibly satisfying when you get to do that, but don't do it too soon. Make sure that you've got all those useful links. Now, we can see here we've got 229 results to sort through. Seems like a lot, but you'll see after about half you tend to hit that sweet spot. Depends on the entity, depends on the ambiguity. Now, the more ambiguous, the more you'll have to go through, because that sweet spot will seem to have come, and then you'll find lots of nuggets further down the line. But in fact, I'll just show you really quickly here. You can see all of them are on this page. So if there are any particular pages you already know about, you can just do Control F and search for them using the search bar, which is a really good way just to pull up the ones that you know should be there. Right, we start off with this. It's an interview. It says a mention here, but in fact we can see that it's an interview. That is in fact an article about Anton Shulke. So we want to edit the classification. We want to say it's an article about him, and we want to include it in schema. And we have indirect control because we can ask Milosh to change that for us if we want to, and he probably will because he's a friend. Articles about and profiles are your biggest friends. They're the ones we're looking for. Those are the ones that really help Google to understand. Articles about are theoretically from third parties over whom we have no influence, and therefore Google sees them as being very relevant. So if you can get an article about the entity, and that article is incredibly explicit about the elements that you're trying to communicate to Google about that entity, you're on to a winner. Now, using schema will include an article about as a subject of. If it's a profile, it will include it as same as, which means that, as you can see, this is preparation for the schema, which is the next step along. Now we submit that and it's disappeared, which is great and very, very satisfying. Now, marketing radio show, this is taking it as an article about. Here, it's a podcast appearance, so we could classify it as a podcast appearance. There is a reasonable amount of text. It's got a lot of mentions of Anton, so I would consider that's potentially an article about, and obviously all of this is quite debatable. It's up to you, the approach you want to take, how widely you want to interpret these descriptions. As you can see, you can read through them in your own good time, but we've described what kind of content exactly we're looking for. We think it should be for being classified in each of these different kind of little buckets. This being the bucket I mentioned earlier, where we just throw everything that's useless. Here, these ones, the red ones, they're really not going to be very useful. So in fact, they could all be thrown in the bucket, which is, as you'll see, the nice quick way with the big red button. So we could say that's an article about. It could also be a podcast. That will be a perfectly legitimate choice because it is a podcast. But I would argue there is some text that Google can read that mentions Anton's name a lot. Therefore, we can say it's an article about, and we know Darian Kovacs. So indirect. None is when we really don't know the person, or it's a journalist, or it's a site that we have no control over at all. Partial is when we can change part of the content, but not all of it. And complete is when we own the site. So that's in there. Next, Profile with partial control and used in schema, yes. Now we use that in schema as same as, and here, because the automatic system got it right, I can just click confirm classification. Next, interview with Anton Shulke, article about, indirect, that's Leda Solis. Using schema, that's a good call as well by Kalicube, which is wonderful. Next, the Twitter account, this is his Twitter account. I can double check that if I'm not sure. That is Anton. It's a profile, it's partial, because we control most of the content, but not all of it, because we do not control the domain. They could close that at any time, or they could change the way it's all presented. And we're using schema, yes, because that represents this entity, and only this entity. Now, that's the important thing about the schema, using it as same as, or even subject of, is that the article or page needs to be primarily, majoritarily about this entity. So we're talking 80% or more. And obviously Anton's Twitter profile is all about him. Then we have Guider Initiative Talks, whatever that might be. It's another podcast. Now here you see we've got less text, only 4 or 5 mentions. I would classify that as, although he's telling his story, it's a podcast because there isn't the text for Google to actually get its teeth into. Now, we really should have caught that one because it's got podcasts in the URL. So that's foolish of us in the extreme. We don't want to use it in same as because it doesn't represent this entity primarily, majoritarily, 80% or more. Creating winning SEO strategy, that looks like a webinar where he didn't actually do anything. In fact, it's not even a webinar because he doesn't participate. He's not a guest. So that will be a mention. And he has partial control because he works for SEMrush. Anton Shulke, mention indirect status. There you go. This is one of his tweets. So that's just a mention at best, or you can stick it in the bucket. I mean, this is useless. This isn't really going to help us in terms of the knowledge panel. I tend to leave mentions. I've had clients who use Kalicube as a mention tracker, in which case if you're going to be doing that and using this as a mention tracker, you want to make sure that that classification in mention here or any of these other ones is accurate, so that you can just pull out all the green ones later on and have a look at those for your client. He's got partial control because it's Twitter, and I can then submit that, which I forgot to do. Same thing. Partial. Now, obviously here, it really does depend on how much I want to get involved in this, how much I want to track mentions and how much I'm just looking for the knowledge panel. And if you look here, what we can do is if I find a pattern, i.e., for example, a site with a lot of stuff that I want to sort through, I can just filter them through like that. And here you can see I've got mention indirect. They're all statuses. Well, they're not terribly useful. And I can just go through them, and it saves me a little bit of time by going confirm, but there you go, it worked. Okay, and then I get rid of the filter, and we're back to where we were. Now you see this is the same site as the other one. The numbers have reset. I haven't got super smart enough to be able to do that dynamically as we go through, but we do get rid of them. There you go. Similar, that's another webinar I was going to say. In fact, it's a podcast or a webinar. It's the same as the other one. Doesn't really help, I would say. It says it's an article about, I would say that's a podcast. And that's wonderful. Next, this is a profile page on SEMrush. What we will see is when we actually go through the next stage, we will correct that, and we could add the description that we will be writing or that we have already written wherever it's gone. Up here, there, this description here, we would add that to this. And in fact here what we can do is add a little note, add the description to this page, and that will show up when we come to this to tell us that's what we need to do. It's a profile page, we have partial control, we want to use it in schema, and we want to add that description. That appears as a message. So if you're doing the stage later on, which is the corroboration, you will see your own message and you will remember what you were thinking about. And if you're not doing it, you're giving a message to somebody else so they know what they should be doing. Now, just double check that's the same Anton Shulke that we know. That is him. Delightful photograph. Influencer lead, might want to update that, but that's a profile with partial control and we were using schema. That's perfect. We could have added a comment if we had anything particularly specific to say on that. Once again, he's not a guest. He's got pulled out for one single mention in the entire page, which I now can't find, but it's in there somewhere. He must have got mentioned by one of the guests. So that is not a webinar because he is not one of the primary people in it, and he has partial control because he works there, and we can submit that. That's a couple of mentions. We're not talking majoritarily about Anton. Partial control, well, it's indirect because it's not his department, I would imagine. So there you go. There you go, there's Kalicube. This is a profile page and he has partial control. This is a rubbish description. We can definitely update that. So I would go in here and I would say, right, that's a profile. I have indirect control because, well, Anton can talk to me about changing that. We use in schema, update the description. This one is very short. And there you go. And as I do all of these, they will now appear in this list. So as you can see, this is one you would look at later on. And when we see, here we go, the suggestion that does appear, add the description to this page, the description we put earlier on. So we're keeping everybody up to date with what it is they need to do. How to use Livestream to build a community with Anton Shulke. That's a very slow site. So we'll go back to working while we wait for it. This is a podcast episode. He was on my podcast, which is delightful. There you go. That isn't enough text, in my opinion, to count as an article about him. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 mentions. That's debatable. It thinks it's a webinar, but we're going to go for podcast, indirect control. We don't want to use it in schema because it isn't sufficiently about him. How to use live streaming. There we go. Digital marketing radio. That's a lot of text. That's really, really, really useful. Well done, David Bain. It's an article about, we got that right. It's indirect because we know David Bain using schema markup. There you go. Brilliant. Zoom info. It's a very short description, but it is still a description and it's still uniquely about him or majoritarily about him. So that is a profile, it's partial, and we would use it in schema and we can go for confirm this classification. As you can see, as we go through, with this number's going down, it's quite a slow process. But once you've done it once, each time your snapshot will update, there will be very few new links unless you've generated an awful lot of content. I'll just go around down to the bottom here and show this one, for example. Hang on, let's find one. Dan Sharp, director, Screaming Frog. He gets a mention on Dan Sharp's page, but as you can see, you know, it's Dan Sharp from Screaming Frog. That doesn't really help us, potentially because we know Dan Sharp. What is that mention? You can't even say it anymore. It must have been a temporary one here with people also viewed. So we can actually just send that straight to the bucket. There you go. That's gone to the bucket. It's in a section that never appears in this corroboration list here. Basically, everything that's green, if we look here, all of these will appear in the corroboration list and can potentially be updated. So if you're looking at a data source, it will be Wikidata, Wikipedia, WordLift, or another site like that, DBpedia, where it's actually a data source that Google is looking at that you would want to go in, correct, check. Profile, obviously very important. Own site with content about the entity. That's basically a site you own where the page is talking quite a lot about the entity, but not 80% or more, let's say 20, 30, 40%. And we want to make sure that information corroborates what it is we're saying on other sites we own, because obviously owned sites, once Google's understood that that's an owned site, it really wants to see and expects to see consistent information across it. Review sites for different platforms, for software, for SaaS, and so on and so forth. Articles about, as I said, incredibly important. a podcast where the person appears on a podcast as a guest or a host. Article by, when somebody's written an article, that can be very useful as well, much less so than article about, because with schema markup it's very difficult to point that out. Event or conference where the person has spoken or the company has sponsored if it's a company. Video that talks about where the company is discussed, or a webinar where the person has appeared. Article contributed. Articles where the entity is cited as a co-author. Comparison pages, a lot for softwares and products, and sometimes companies too. Mention, as I said, you can use this mention tracker, and here if you want to get really granular you can, right down to here. That helps us with the system with Kalicube, because we're going to feed this into some AI, machine learning, and try to figure out how to get this much better. But at the same time, if you just stick things in the bucket, it gets rid of it, it saves you time and moves you forward much more quickly, because obviously these green ones are the only ones that will appear in the corroboration when you get to that stage. Now, as you can see, before finishing this particular one, obviously you go through all of the list. As I said, when you come to the point where you get 10 in a row that are useless, or 6 to 10 or 12, whatever it might be, but when you feel, this is getting useless, you can use this magic button. You check here and you click send all remaining to bucket, and everything will be sent to bucket in this list will be cleaned up. And that's a really good idea to do that, because on the next snapshot you will then be able to start afresh and you will see quite a clean list. And here you can see 527, that means there are 27 potential profile pages. We have confirmed 5 of them. 3 confirmed articles about from the 20 that Kalicube initially identified. And as you see very quickly here, these numbers will end up being the same. When they are all the same, you will have finished that entire list. And congratulations at that point. That's it. Thank you very much.